Hi, so we continue with Unit 2, where this time around we are going to look at the concluding session, which is session 3 of Unit 2, which is still on growth and trade. So what we want to look at now here is to take the case of a small nation, then later on we'll look at a large nation and see how the changes in the factor inputs or the growth in technology will affect the nation's trade volumes. And with this, we're going to look at the whole world, or specifically a large nation, and then a small nation, where a small nation will not be able to affect the world prices. Let's begin by looking at this graphical illustration. So consider a nation which has specialized in the production of commodity X and moves all the way to point B, where the international terms of trade equal to 1, and at point B the nation produces 120 units of commodity X and then 20 units of commodity Y. And if this nation was to consume at point E, it means then the nation will have to export 60 units of X and import 60 units of Y and then move to point E. So from this point, we see then that the nation, a small nation, is not able to affect the international terms of trade. So in other words, this straight line here represents the offer curve of the whole world or the large nation. Whereas for nation 2, we have these offer curves. So nation 1, which is a small nation, will have these small curves. And if we consider nation 1 to be before growth being operating on offer curve nation 1, which is we can call N1, then it means that it will export 60 units of X and import 60 units of Y and consume at point E. Then from here, suppose that there was growth in labor, which is the factor which is intensive, or let's just say there is growth in the factor used in the production of commodity X. That means then, according to factor growth, the production possibility frontier will shift outward, and because of this shift outward, the output of both commodities can increase. However, following Rybinski theory, we see that the production of commodity X will more than double, while the production of commodity Y will reduce down from 20 to 10. So therefore, we see that more of X has been produced and less of Y has been produced. And if this nation exports 150 of X and imports 150 of Y, it will go all the way and consume at point Z here, which is indifference curve 7. And at this indifference curve, we see that the nation is on a higher indifference curve, and therefore it has improved the welfare of the nation. So from there, we see that with free trade after growth, nation 1 is able to exchange 150 units of X for 150 units of Y at the international terms of trade of 1. So therefore, we see that more has been the volumes of trade have increased. Since the output of commodity X increases while the output of commodity Y declines, the growth of output is said to be pro-trade. So we see that here from point B, when the nation receives an increase in the factors needed in the production of X, we see that the production of X increases, and X is the commodity of its comparative advantage, and therefore the exportable commodity, while the production of commodity Y, which is the production of the importable commodity, has declined, then such growth is said to be pro-trade. In the same way, we see that the consumption of commodity Y has increased proportionately more than the consumption of commodity X. So if you compare this point here, point E, where we were consuming before growth, and the point Z, where we're consuming after growth, we see that the consumption of commodity Y has doubled, so from 80 to 160, whereas the consumption of commodity X has less than doubled. So we are just moving from 70 here to 120. so which is about 50. So this means that the consumption of X has less than doubled. So the consumption of the importable commodity has increased proportionately more than the consumption of the exportable commodity, which shows that we see that from the consumption side, the growth here is pro-trade. Now, since both production and consumption is a pro-trade, the volumes of trade expanded proportionately more than the output of commodity X. So we see from here that the output of commodity X increased from 120 all the way to somewhere 270 here. But if you look at the volumes of trade, you will have 150 coming in as import and 150 going out as export, which means that we have about 300 units exported. And I mean exported and imported in totality. Therefore, the volumes of trade have increased more than the output. So with the commodity X and commodity Y, which have all increased in terms of consumption, so we see that if you are at point E, consumption of commodity X has increased. So we see this 50 increase in the consumption of X and the 80 increase in the consumption of Y. It means that both X and Y are normal goods. And as such, if they are normal goods, recall that normal goods are goods whose consumption increase when the income levels increase. Okay. So now let's look at technical progress. What we looked at is the change in the factor input. So recall that the neutral technical progress at the same rate in the production of both commodities lead to a proportionate expansion in the output of both commodities at constant relative commodity prices. Now, before looking at the types of technical progress, we looked at the technical progress in general and termed it as the Hicksian technical progress, where we are looking at how many units of labor will be needed in the production of a commodity and how many should be saved. Okay, so with that, if consumption of each commodity also increases proportionately in the nation, then it means that the volumes of trade will increase at the same rate at the constant terms of trade. So since consumption of the commodity has increased proportionately more in the nation, it means that the volumes of trade will also have to increase. But the increase will be at the same rate because we are looking at the neutral technical progress. And what we will note is that the neutral expansion of production and consumption will lead to the same rate of expansion of trade. So with neutral production and the pro-trade consumption, the volume of trade would expand proportionately more than production. So recall that what we are seeing here is that if production is neutral but consumption is pro-trade, it means that the net effect of this thing will be pro-trade. And if production is neutral and consumption is anti-trade, it means the net effect will be anti-trade. So now, looking at the case that we have where production is neutral and consumption is pro-trade, then the volumes of trade would expand proportionately more than production because the end net results will be pro-trade. Only in the case where production is pro-trade, consumption is anti-trade, are we going to consider the net effect to see which one outweighs the other. So with that then, with neutral production and anti-trade consumption, remember we stated that the volumes of trade would expand proportionately less than production. However, regardless of what happens to the volumes of trade, the welfare of the representative citizen will increase with constant labor and the population with constant terms of trade. So, given whatever we do, remember the goal is that whenever we have technical progress, we expect the welfare of the nation's citizens to improve because now we have more resources that we are channeling to the production, and therefore we are saving the labor and the capital which are being taken in the production process. Neutral technical progress in the production of the exportable commodity only is said to be pro-trade, and the neutral technical progress in the production of the importable commodity only is said to be anti-trade. Okay, let's shift our focus to looking at the large nation. So if growth, regardless of its source or type, expands the nation's volume of trade at constant prices, then the nation's terms of trade tend to deteriorate. Now, because remember, when we are looking at the increase in the volumes of trade, we are looking at how many exportables the nation has produced and how many importables it has produced. If the production of the exportable commodity has increased, is more than the production of the importable commodity, then it means growth will be pro-trade. Now, because there are too many exportables that the nation has, it means that the nation will have to, for it to export all those units, it will have to be facing a lower price on the market, because there will be a lot of goods which are supposed to be sold out. And because the nation will be demanding more of the importable commodity, it means that then the price of the importable commodity will relatively go up. And as such, the nation's terms of trade will tend to deteriorate. And conversely, if growth reduces the nation's volume of trade at constant prices, the nation's terms of trade will then improve, because the resources will be few, the goods to be sold will be few, and therefore the nation can bargain for a higher price. And even the resources that it is going to import will be less, it can bargain for a lower price and therefore have an improved terms of trade. With these two effects, then, we refer to this as the terms of trade effect of growth, where we are looking at how the volumes of trade will be affected, as well as the terms of trade, if the nation is pursuing a trade which is pro-trade or which is anti-trade. So the effect of growth on the nation's welfare then depends on the net result of the terms of trade effect as well as the wealth effect. The wealth effect refers to the change in the output per worker or per person as a result of growth. What we are seeing then is that how many units are being produced in relation to the population. So in other words, we are measuring wealth or output per capita, which is in relation to the entire population, so that we obtain the average. And out of this, we are able to see if each individual's average output has increased, then we have an improvement in the welfare. So from this then, we will note that a positive wealth effect by itself tends to increase the nation's welfare, whereas a negative wealth effect will reduce the nation's welfare. And if the nation's effect is positive and the nation's terms of trade improve as a result of growth and trade, then the nation's welfare will definitely improve, because there is an improvement in the nation's welfare as well as an improvement in the terms of trade. On the other side, we see that if they are both unfavorable, then the nation's welfare will decline. And finally, what we see is that if the wealth effect and the terms of trade effect move in opposing direction or different directions, the nation's welfare may deteriorate, may improve, or may remain unchanged depending on the relative strength of the two opposing forces. So this should also be noted that we are building this from the changes in factor inputs as well as technical progress. Let's look at the graphical illustration of the large nation. So suppose that we have nation 1, which has a comparative advantage in producing commodity X, and therefore nation 1, which is assumed to be large, goes to produce at point B before the growth takes place. We will see that at this point, this nation may will produce 130 units of X, and therefore by trading with nation 2, it will export 60X and import 60 of Y and consume at point E. So with the terms of trade then deteriorating from 1 to say a half, it means that then the nation will have to face a different angle of trade. And if we assume, we see that there is growth, and after growth we see the terms of trade deteriorating, then the nation will produce at point N as opposed to producing at point M if the terms of trade have not deteriorated. So with the deterioration in the terms of trade, it means that the nation then will produce at point N. Now recall what is causing the terms of trade to deteriorate is the production of the exportables and the importables. So in pursuing the pro-trade, you will notice that the terms of trade will deteriorate, and if we assume that they force a nation to produce at point N, then the nation will end up consuming at point T. So we see that then with that, the nation is able to expand the production and then go and consume at point T. However, this point T is not the main optimal point because it is on the lower indifference curve, because it has exchanged 140 of X for 70 of Y with nation 2. And therefore, this point is lower, and you will notice that the nation still has the capacity to produce more. Now, since the indifference curve is lower than the one which it would have consumed at if the terms of trade did not deteriorate, the nation's welfare will have declined even more. So then, if we bring in this offer curve, you will see that if the nation's terms of trade, by the way, here it's in autarky, and if the nation's has not yet received growth, it means that the nation is able to specialize in the production of X, export 60X and import 60Y, and be at point E with nation 2. And then if the nation has received growth in the production of commodity X, it means that the offer curve will tilt outward to show that the nation will now be able to export 140 of X and import 70 of Y and consume at point T, with the terms of trade deteriorating down to half. So this is what we are seeing then, that with the deterioration in the terms of trade, the nation will be in equilibrium at point T. And if the terms of trade do not deteriorate but remain at 1, it means that instead of consuming at point T and exporting 140, the nation will then export 150 and import 160 of Y and consume at point Z, which is on a higher indifference curve 7 here. Okay, so let's look at growth in both nations. Suppose we are looking at it from both nations. If we assume that both nations are large, then you will see that if the nations are initially at point E, let's call it E1. So at this point, where nation 1 is exporting 60X and importing 60Y, we are defining equilibrium here before growth. And suppose that there was growth in the factors, it means that then if nation 1 is the one that received the growth, we will see the terms of trade deteriorating down to half, so that equilibrium then will occur at this point. And if nation 2 is the one that received the growth, we will see the terms of trade deteriorating and equilibrium will occur at this point. So then, what we see out of this is that we have nation 1, which has improved with the growth this side, and nation 2 on the other side. So if the two nations then have terms of trade which have not deteriorated but remained at 1, it means that equilibrium will not settle here. Equilibrium will settle at E4. This is where the nation's international terms of trade are. All the terms of trade are meeting at the relative price of 1. But what you will notice is that the nations tend to retaliate when its terms of trade deteriorate. Suppose that we are looking at nation 2, which is already initially on indifference offer curve 2, and then nation 1, which is also at offer curve 1, and that suppose that for the nation, the volumes of trade, the nation decides to reduce the volumes of trade so that it improves its terms of trade by moving down to offer curve 1, and then expecting equilibrium to be at E, this will not, E5, this will not settle, because nation 2 will do likewise as well by trying to improve its terms of trade and therefore cutting on the volumes of trade and move to offer curve 2. In the end, the equilibrium will be at E7 here, where the volumes of trade will have deteriorated further in the pursuit to improve the terms of trade, and the terms of trade will end up being unaffected as it will be equal to 1. So whatever effort is being put, nations are likely to retaliate to the actions of the other nations in order to keep its terms of trade unaffected or better. Okay, so thank you very much for watching. If you have questions, please send an email to muawelias@gmail.com. I will see you in Unit 3, where we're going to look at the Heckscher-Ohlin model and then describe its effect on the trade, and then look at the Leontief paradox. Bye-bye.